and may die from respiratory arrest. You think at the top of one's list about opioids, although opioids as an inhalational agent, there really was very little experience about that, although it sounded like the toxidrome that was associated with all these people from the theater sounded like an opioid toxidrome. So the Russians at that time said that they had used some sort of anesthetic gas and that it was something potentially with fentanyl. So that was the information that they publicly released, although a gas, fentanyl is not usually a gas. It's used as a parenteral agent. So again, there are a lot of missing points. Now, there was a German toxicologist who had the chance of examining a couple of these patients in the ensuing days, and he thought that there was some sort of anesthetic gas. He wasn't exactly sure what it might have been, maybe a halogenated anesthetic. Certainly, it sounded like some sort of inhaled gas that would put people down, but he was unable to do any sort of laboratory determination specifically. So I particularly got interested in this case because I had just come back from Russia about a month before this event, and I was over in Russia, actually at this demilitarization conference. It was actually quite interesting. And I've been to Russia twice. The first time I'd been to Russia, I spent some time in Yekaterinburg, which is a city in the Urals, and it was a fascinating place. I spent this time at this toxicology hospital, saw a lot of interesting poisonings there. And it happened to be the same city that the Tsar was killed back at the time of the revolution. But when I went to this conference in 2002, I got to speak to a Soviet scientist, an ex-Soviet scientist, and I asked him, what sort of novel drugs had they investigated during Soviet times. And he said a very interesting drug, which I had never thought would have been used by the military. He said they were trying to weaponize dioxin. Now, dioxin is a chemical that is not a fast-acting chemical, but it's a chemical that in certain animal species, particularly guinea pigs, is extraordinarily toxic. Although in humans, its toxicity is not quite like it is in guinea pigs. It may potentially be a carcinogen. That remains somewhat unclear, but it's known to cause chloracne, which is this very disfiguring dermatologic process. And what was so interesting was, now this, fast forward about 2 years, but the prime minister candidate in the Ukrainian elections in 2004 was Yushchenko, and during the midst of this election, he broke out with this very disfiguring eruption on his face, and before anyone pinpointed what it certainly was suggestive of chloracne. And I thought to myself, wow, the Russians or the Soviets had potentially militarized dioxin, and here we have a prime minister candidate who is very anti-Russian breaking out with this chloracne. And as it turns out, he was poisoned with dioxin, and he had the second highest dioxin level that had been recorded up to that date. So the Russians were very interested in a variety of different poisons, and this goes back years before that with Georgian Markov, who was a Bulgarian journalist dissident who, on a London bridge, was stabbed with an umbrella that had introduced a tiny bit of ricin, which is a very, very potent mitochondrial inhibitor, and he died. At the time, they thought he died of septic shock, but subsequent investigation revealed that he died from ricin. Very novel, intriguing, and the Russians have a whole legacy of using poisons, even as recently as in the last year or so. But this was Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006, who died from polonium 2010. So by putting all this together, I'm thinking, there's the use of ricin, there's the polonium, there's the dioxin, and now we have this strange gas, which is not quite clear what exactly happened. So if you go back a few years before the Moscow event, there were a series of reports that were in the public domain. Subsequently, they've been removed from the public domain, but they were public domain about chemicals that were used for incapacitation and so-called less than lethal technologies. And this was of interest because in adversarial situation, you may not want to, kill the opponent, just disable them in some way. So there were active research programs from militaries around the world looking at some of these non-lethal weapons. So here it says that non-lethal weapons are weapon systems that are explicitly designed and primarily employed so to incapacitate personnel or materials while minimizing fatalities, permanent injury, etc. Non-lethal weapons will not be required to have zero probability of producing fatalities. So again, the thought is that the chemical can incapacitate. They may not be 100% perfect in terms of not causing a fatality, but the intent is not to cause a fatality. And there are a number of different approaches, some chemicals, but of interest, and this is kind of off the subject, but certainly of interesting, is some acoustic technologies. And you might have read over the last few years about various folks that have had these disabling neurological conditions thought to be from noise. This happened at the Cuban embassy in Cuba and elsewhere. I think there have been some European events as well, using noise that may incapacitate, not chemicals, but again, this kind of less than lethal technology. So in 2000, which was right before the Moscow event, there was this report that came out about the advantages and limitations of combatives for use as a non-lethal technique. And what's on the front page but fentanyl? So I thought, wow, this is really fascinating that, that fentanyl itself, which was known as this very, very potent opioid, was being investigated as a non-lethal technique, because we think, oh my God, fentanyl is so potent that it can easily kill. This report discussed this sort of drug class. It's not really a pharmacological class per se, but the so-called calmative, which is to depress the central nervous system and produce a coma perhaps. And the ideal calmative should be easy to administer, short onset of action, should be reversible, hopefully, and there was a lot of research into this. And not only did they discuss calmatives per se, but they also discussed inhaled calmatives in terms of aerosolized opioids. Now, looking back then, no one had really, at least in the medical community, had been thinking about aerosolized opioids. It wasn't any sort of a pharmacopoeia approach to the treatment of pain, although in general anesthesia, one uses inhaled agents. They're not opioids. They're the hydrocarbon-based agents, but that's what's conventionally used in general anesthesia. So going back to this report with fentanyl on the front cover is actually a paragraph about carfentanil. And before this time, I'd never heard of carfentanil before, but it says carfentanil has gained new interest because of the recent pursuit of novel calmative agents capable of unconventional administration. Although not yet used in the human population, this drug offers the potential advantage of being administered to non-compliant or violent patients in situations requiring only indirect contacts. So you think, why did the Russians utilize such a strategy to try to put down this terrorist uprising? There was literature to support the fact that a opioid, a fentanyl derivative like carfentanil, may be an agent that would serve that purpose. I still couldn't get. Still wasn't clear to me about the aerosolization of this. I did an extensive literature search at the time, and there certainly wasn't anything in the medical literature. But there was this one report from this company, this drug monitoring company called Cross, and they were conducting a number of studies. And one of the studies they were conducting was on aerosolized carfentanil. I said, "Oh my God, we have a company that's monitoring a study using aerosolized carfentanil." All these people just went down in the theater. The Russians, although they wouldn't say exactly what they used, probably used aerosolized carfentanil. Now it's all kind of coming together. And so carfentanil was produced by Janssen Pharmaceuticals, the same fellow that developed fentanyl, and it's a fentanyl derivative. Its mechanism of action is similar to fentanyl. It works, through the opioid receptors, but it just happens to be much more potent, as you'll see. And at this time, it was actually available as as a pharmaceutical, but not for people, but for big animals. And it was marketed under the trade name of wild nil, which was used to immobilize large mammal species, usually to move them from place to place, not to kill them. And in the package insert, it talks about how it had been demonstrated in deer and moose and elk and other sorts of large animals. And I have this one video here. Could you just tap? There's one more video here.
Matthew Mutinda is standing by with a tranquilizer.
That's in 10:45.
It'll be a few minutes before Wendy goes to sleep.
So this is a good situation. She's not too panicked. She hasn't given alarm calls, so the rest of the family are relatively secure. She can't quite figure out what's happened to her. She's been stung by something that really hurt, but she's okay.
So this carfentanil is not meant for people. It's meant for big animals like big elephants, and you get the right dose. It's used not to kill the elephant, but to sedate the elephant so they can move the elephant from place to place. And that was the intent of wild nil. So wild African elephants, an animal that carfentanil is used on, weigh between 5,000 to 14,000 pounds, which is roughly 26 to 72 times the weight of your average adult male. And we'll get into why carfentanil over the next few slides. So this was a table I put together. Soon after the Moscow Theater event, I got interested in the whole thing. I wasn't savvy to any data that was not in the public domain, but by piecing together what I've described, we wrote this paper. And I put together this table looking at the potency of carfentanil versus fentanyl versus morphine. And versus morphine, it's 10,000 times more potent, which is just extraordinary. Even versus fentanyl, it's 30 times more potent. So it's a very, very potent analog of fentanyl, as are a number of the other fentanyl analogs as well. Now, fast forward to 2012, this is the first paper, the first and I think only paper, that analyzed clothing and urine from the Moscow Theater casualties and revealed both carfentanil and remifentanil. So this is the only literature in the public domain that confirms the exposure, but what the Russians had used back then to try to sedate the folks in the theater, but not kill them, although they ended up killing many of them, was carfentanil. So if carfentanil is used to sedate elephants, why is it showing up in heroin? And that was the question that's come up in the last several years. Now, if you go onto some of these drug sites, so there's a number of drug sites where drug-using people share their experiences. There was this dialogue, this was back in 2011, about carfentanil. And one of the guys says, the last one says, "Oh, guys, I just found this on another forum. A guy says he went down to Mexico, bought carfentanil from a pharmacy down there. This is the only report I've stumbled upon for wild nil, which is the trade name that I mentioned. And I haven't found any for immobling. This stuff, it seems like that this stuff is safe for use as long as you take extremely small amounts of it at a time." So it was even discussed among the drug-using community as this really powerful opioid, although warnings that you have to take a very, very small amount. If you go onto the internet, you can find recipes to synthesize the carfentanil. And then the first reports starting in late 2016 about heroin being laced with this carfentanil at the same time that you could actually buy the carfentanil back then over the internet. So why carfentanil? It's about 100 times more potent, or 30 to 100 times more potent than fentanyl.